Hello there, Audrienne here from livesnaplove.com, and today we are going to be talking about lenses, and very specifically I'm going to be answering a question that I get a lot, which is, do I need to upgrade from the kit lens? And if so, what lens should I get? So stick around, we're going to answer that question and I'm going to go through some different lenses with you. So let's start by looking at what a kit lens actually is. So a kit lens is when you buy a camera, usually an entry or mid-level camera, and it comes as a sort of kit. So you get your DSLR camera body and you get a lens with it. So it comes really as a kit. And these lenses, these kit lenses, are usually fantastic from terms of focal length, because what they'll tend to be is something like an 18 to 55 millimeter, and that will give you a good range of focal lengths in one lens. So 18 to 55 millimeter is a fantastic range that will allow you to capture photos indoors, outdoors, and to get portrait style images with your DSLR starter lens, or sorry, starter body, camera body I should say. So it's a fantastic lens in terms of the focal length, but the downside to these lenses tends to be their aperture value. In other words, the maximum aperture that they can open up to. And you'll usually find that these are something like f3.6 to f5.6. And that's a variable aperture, which means as you zoom in or as you zoom out, that maximum aperture gets smaller or bigger. So usually when you're zoomed all the way in, that is when you will have a smaller aperture, and then when you zoom out, you will have the larger aperture. But that aperture numbers, that f3.6 to f5.6, doesn't actually tend to let a whole lot of light into the camera. And this is where your kit lenses tend to not perform perhaps as well as some of the other lenses, but this is mainly indoors. So if you're shooting outdoors with a kit lens, you'll usually be fine. But what tends to happen, then you come and move indoors, and then you will struggle to let enough light in via your aperture. And then what happens is that you need to either increase your ISO number, which in turn can lead to more grain, or you tend to use a slower shutter speed than you might like. And again, we can get slightly soft images just because we've introduced some motion blur. So your kit lenses that come with the camera, they're a great starter. In other words, they allow you to pick up your DSLR camera that you've just bought and be able to use it. But I do recommend that you purchase a upgraded lens at some point in time. And the reason being is because of that aperture value. So the focal lengths tend to be good with those kit lenses, but the aperture values tend not to be. So I do recommend that if you can, then you spend some money upgrading from the kit lens. Now, there are lots of different options available to you, and this is going to depend on a few different factors. It's going to depend on what camera body you're currently using, whether it's a full frame or a crop frame. It's going to depend a lot on your budget, because let's face it, you can spend just $100 or $50 even on a lens, right the way up to a couple of $1,000s. So there is a vast difference in pricing for your lenses. And it's also going to depend where and what you want to shoot. And so with all those three things in mind, I'm going to give you some suggestions of lenses that you can look at and check out for yourself. But very specifically, I'm going to talk about the focal lengths and the aperture values rather than the specific type of lens itself, because what you'll find is that you can get lenses from Canon, from Nikon, from Sigma, from Tamron, from, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but Yonahoo. So you can get different lenses in these focal lengths. But the sort of standard upgrade lens is the 50mm f1.4 lens. Now, I don't actually have that one, but I do have this one, which is the 50mm f1.4. So it's similar. It's just a little bit more of an upgrade from the f1.8. But the 50mm f1.8 lens is a kind of universal upgrade lens. And the reason for that is you can pick one up brand new for around $120. And that 50mm focal length is still quite versatile, and that aperture, that f1.8, means you're going to get more light in via your aperture. So you, as I said, you can get these from many manufacturers, the Canon one, Nikon. I've also heard quite good things about one from Yonaghu. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I think it's YONGHO. And they do a 50mm lens at about, I think it's around $50, and it seems to get quite good reviews. So that would be another one that I would check out. Now, the problem that you can run into with the 50mm lens is that when you pop that onto a crop frame sensor, which is what you're probably using if you bought a camera, entry-level camera, and it came with a kit lens, then it's probably a crop frame sensor. And that means that the lenses perform a little bit differently on your camera body. So a good kind of rule of thumb, or a good way to remember about your focal lengths and to determine whether a focal length is right for you, is to bear in mind that with a full frame camera, and I will get to how this changes with a crop frame in a moment, but with a 50mm focal length on a full frame camera gives you roughly the same field of view as the naked eye. So when you lift your camera up to your eye and you have a 50mm on, it's going to give you roughly the same view as the naked eye. If you have a larger number than 50mm, 85mm, 135mm, they are going to look more zoomed in, and everything's going to look closer. It's going to fill up more of the frame. If you have a smaller number than 50, then that is going to give you a wider angle of view. In other words, everything's going to look further apart. It's going to be more spaced out. It's going to look smaller in the frame than it would with the naked eye. So that's a really good rule of thumb, just to be able to see how a lens is going to perform. Now, as I said, that's all for a full frame. If you have a crop frame camera, and if you're watching this and you have a kit lens, and I'm guessing that you do, then it performs slightly differently. Because what you need to do is actually sort of multiply that by f1.6, and that gives you the equivalent focal length. So a 50mm on a crop frame sensor will act more like an 85mm. And that means rather than everything looking as it would with the naked eye, everything's going to look a little bit more zoomed in. And in order to get a field of view that is similar to the naked eye, you're going to need to use a lesser focal length. So instead of 50mm, you're going to want to have a smaller number. Something like a 30mm will give you the same field of view as the naked eye. So do keep that in mind when you are looking at lenses, that when people generally discuss the focal length of a lens, they usually discuss how it performs on a full frame. You want to make sure that you factor that in. It's called the crop factor. And to factor that in to make sure that you understand how the lens is going to perform on your body. So we were just talking about the 50mm being this universal upgrade lens, and in fact it was the lens that I chose first of all, and I loved that lens, to be honest, and I used that for years. Now the downside to that is, as I said, on that starter body, on your entry-level camera or even mid-level camera, it's going to perform more like an 85mm, which means everything's going to look that little bit more zoomed in. So it's perfect if you shoot a lot outdoors, or you want to take portrait style images, then that 50mm focal length on your crop frame sensor is going to be absolutely wonderful, and you need not worry about a thing. However, if you tend to shoot more lifestyle or documentary style images, you're going to find that maybe the 50mm is a little bit too zoomed in for shooting indoors. You have to back up a little bit more than you would like in order to get everything in the frame. If that's you, then I would suggest getting something between a 25 and a 35mm. So anything from, as I say, 24mm, you'll get some lenses, Sigma do a 30mm or a 35mm. The most common are 24 and then 35. Now these tend to be a little bit more expensive, but again, the Sigma 30mm, for example, is still quite reasonable, and you can get a 24mm for around $160, I think it is. So they can still be reasonably affordable. So I would look for that focal length if you do shoot indoors a lot. Now, what you can do, if you have the kit lens that came with your camera, you'll see that as you have that zoom lens, it's got the numbers of the focal length on the front. As you zoom in and zoom out, that will change from 18 all the way up to 55. You can actually use that to determine what might be the best focal length for you. So set that at 50, shoot with that for a little while, see whether you like it, see what it's like indoors. Set that to 35, see how you like it, shoot with that indoors and outdoors, and go at 24mm and just see how all those focal lengths perform for you. So that's a little tip for you. If you do have that kit lens, you can use that to determine the focal length that is going to be best for you. Now, the other thing to look at is that aperture value. And as I said, that Canon or Nikon 50mm f1.8, that's giving you f1.8 as your maximum aperture. So that's allowing you to let in 1 or 2 more stops of light than you might get in through your kit lens. That in turn can allow you to use a lower ISO number or use a faster shutter speed to make sure that you don't get motion blur. So have a look for a lens that is around that. So f1.8, f2.0, f2.8, I wouldn't do anything higher than f2.8. That is going to give you a really good aperture, which will allow you to shoot indoors and allow you to let a little bit more light in via your aperture. Now at this point you might be going, well, I don't actually have the money right now to upgrade my lens. And in which case I hear you. I completely understand where you're coming from. Photography is an expensive hobby. And to be honest, if you have $150 to spare, I'd rather you spend that on education than on a new lens. And you can absolutely get good images with your kit lens. You just are going to have some limitations and you're going to have to learn to work around them. Now what I did in the beginning was I took a lot of photos outdoors because my kit lens allowed me to let enough light in with that, even though it had a smaller aperture than I maybe would have liked, I could deal with that outdoors. And if you were shooting indoors, you make sure you're shooting in a room with plenty of light. So there are more limitations, but it just means that you have to work around them. And we have had, or I have had, so many students in our Auto to Awesome program, and they have taken absolutely amazing images with their kit lenses. So don't feel that just because you have a kit lens, that's holding you back from getting great images. It's not. Trust me that learning how to use the equipment you already have is going to give you far more bang for your buck. But it does mean that you have these limitations to work around. And I don't want to lie to you about that and say that you can maybe do the same things. You can take great images, but you are going to have to work around them. What gear gives you, what better gear gives you, is more choices. So always keep that in mind when considering lens choices. All that's really giving you is a lot more choices about how you shoot. So that was some suggestions for you. Now I do actually have just a freebie that I want to mention at the moment, because what a lot of people want to do is get those really blurry backgrounds. And I want to explain to you that you can still get that with a kit lens. So I'm actually got a freebie for you. I'm going to put up the URL right there. So audreyannphoto.com/aperture, and you'll be able to be able to download an Aperture priority cheat sheet, and that's going to explain more to you about Aperture. So if that had you scratching your head a little bit when I start talking about Aperture values, go and make sure that you grab that. That's going to explain more, and it's also going to give you a guide to getting a blurred background, which you can absolutely do with your kit lens as well. So do be sure to download that freebie as well. As I say, go to audreyannphoto.com freebie.com/aperture, and you can download that for free. And it's got lots of information in the guide for you that you are going to want to take. So I hope that you enjoyed that. I'm just going to dive in and answer a couple of questions now. So Sarah has asked, I have a 24 to 105 millimeter. Is this good? Well, what tends to happen, Sarah, is that when the more focal range you have in your lens, the less sharp that tends to be. So what if you can think about it from the point of view that when they're manufacturing a lens, when they try and do a zoom lens, they're trying to pack a lot of stuff into your lens. And that they tend to then not have that wider aperture. So I don't know what aperture you have on the 24 to 105 millimeter. So what I would say is it might not be as sharp as a prime lens would be. So generally speaking, and this is generally speaking because if you spend a lot of money on a zoom lens, you can get pretty sharp. But generally speaking, a prime lens is a lot sharper than a zoom lens. And it's because they do one thing and they do it exceptionally well. So you tend to be sharper and it tends to have that larger aperture. The zoom lenses give you that more flexibility with your focal length, but in order to give you that flexibility, they do tend to sacrifice a little bit on quality. They tend not to be as sharp, and they also don't have the maximum apertures that you may want to have, like f1.4. So I would consider that, really think about, so zoom lenses, you can absolutely have them. Try and find one that has a fixed aperture. In other words, you won't see two numbers separated with a dash like f3.6 to f5.6. You'll just see f2.8, and try and get that maximum aperture of f2.8. And Addy is saying, I still have an entry level crop camera, but I'm thinking about getting a 24 to 70 f2.8 used. I find myself struggling to frame what I want indoors. I feel the need for a wider range of options instead of a fixed lens. Should I be saving my money for a full frame camera instead? That's a great question. So generally, I would say that you kind of want to have a good lens. So if you put I was trying to think of a nice way to put it, but if you put a crappy lens on a great camera, you know, a more expensive pro level camera body, you're still not going to get particularly sharp images because your lens is what's using to kind of capture. So your sensor is capturing the image, but the lens is what's drawing all that information in. So it's kind of like, if you can imagine having maybe a beautiful clear window and then putting a sheet of perspex in front of it. The window's still beautiful, but you've just put something clear and muddy in front of it. So I do want to stress that I would probably, if it were me, I would upgrade my camera lens before I upgraded my camera body. The 24 to 70 f2.8 is a really good lens. That's a lens that I have been eyeing up, it has to be said. I don't personally shoot with zoom lenses. I don't like them. I don't like zooming in and out. It doesn't work for me. By the time I've zoomed in and then I had to change my settings, I just don't like it. So I prefer to zoom with my feet. I just use one lens and I'll zoom in and out based on that. So, but what I would say is, yes, you can, if you do need that wider range of options, then the 24 to 70 is a great focal range, and the f2.8 is a really good maximum aperture for a zoom lens. So personally, I would probably go for that. And I do actually want to say, I didn't mention this earlier, but you know, for all these entry-level lenses that I suggested, like the Canon 50mm f1.8 or maybe you know, the Nikon versions, do look for used lenses, because what you'll find is a lot of people do this. They'll buy a camera body with a kit lens, they'll then upgrade to something like the Canon 50mm f1.8, they'll use that for a while and then they'll upgrade again. And so these tend to get lightly used and then sold. And again, exactly what happened to mine. Someone got a fantastic deal on that because they paid half of what I paid for it, and I'd only used it for around a year. And lenses tend to not really, unless they get knocked or scratched, if there's no physical impairment to them, they tend not to sort of lose quality. So it can be a really good idea. So if you're in the States, somewhere like B&H Photo, you can also look on eBay. And if you're in the UK, MPB Photographic is a good one. So Sarah is saying, this is great, thank you. I have the Sigma 85 and the cheaper 50mm too. You sound like you are covered, Sarah. Sarah's saying, got to dash, we'll watch rest later. Been great advice, thank you. You're more than welcome, Sarah. If you have the 85 and the 50mm, then the 24-105 is actually going to give you a good range there, because you can have that zoom lens to take with you when you need that flexibility with the focal length, and then you can use your 85 and the 50mm when you want more to focus more on the quality. So if you have, so a lot of when you talk about lens choices, it also is slotting into what you already have existing. If you have more than one lens, what is going to give you that holy trinity, so to speak? So let me see. Barry is asking, I have the 24-105 f4 and it works pretty well for portraits. Yes, I do also have the 50mm f1.8 and it can be soft at f1.8. So I tend not to go below or wider than that f2.8. But one needs to be accurate with focus even at f2.8 as the depth of field is very narrow. How do you ensure good focus on the eye nearest the lens, Audrey? Well, I'm always choosing my own focus points. I never let the camera choose a focus point for me. So I'm always using manual focus select, as in I'm manually selecting my focus points. And the reason I'm being very clear with that is I know you can switch your lens from AF to MF. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about making sure that you select the focus point nearest the eye and do not use focus recompose. That's all I'm going to say there. That is enough to throw off your focus. So I tend not to use that. And as I completely agree with the not going under f2.8, that tends to be a good aperture for that particular lens. Each lens has a different sweet spot. Well, they have a different sweet spot, but they also, some lenses are soft, completely wide open, some aren't. So I have a Sigma here. I got something stuck to my lip. There we go. I have a Sigma 35mm f1.5 here, and this lens is super sharp, wide open. My Canon 50mm f1.4, soft to f1.4. I have to shoot at something like f2.2 in order for that to get sharper. So make sure that you do that, focusing on the eye, and make sure that you are manually selecting your focus points, not letting the camera do that, and don't use focus recompose. So that's it from me today. I hope that you enjoyed this Facebook Live. I'm going to be back again at the same time next week. And I think next week we're going to be talking about focus again with lenses. So do come back and I will be chatting about that then. And I will see you next week. Don't forget to download that free download I have for you there, audreyannphoto.com/aperture, and that's going to give you an aperture priority cheat sheet. It's going to teach you about aperture, about shooting in aperture priority mode, and about getting that blurry background as well. So that's it for me today. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you guys next week. Bye for now.